gobygal, and in this video I'll be covering the preparations of what you have to do before you even buy your tank and what you need to do to make a solid plan of action for your best aquarium ever. So, before you even buy your tank, there are two basic questions you have to cover: what fish and what type. What type really comes first? And what type usually refers to fresh, brackish, or saltwater. However, there are also other ones like what kind of setup do you want? Do you want a peaceful tank? Do you want solitary specimen? These are some questions to consider. I'll address these further in step 5 in exactly what kind of fish setup we can get, but also, so take a look at that if you want to know in more depth about what it is. But right now, let's cover fresh, brackish, and saltwater. Those are probably the main options you could take right now. Each one has its advantages. Beginners probably might want to go towards freshwater because there's a lot of nice fish that are good for beginners, and there's not necessarily there's fewer things you have to monitor. For instance, there's no magnesium or other chemicals, for instance, for corals, and you don't have to worry about keeping your salt balanced. It's pretty straightforward. But saltwater, almost every single fish is colorful, so that's the other benefit for saltwater. And brackish is in between. It's sort of rare, and for early beginners I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if you want to go into a challenge, then you should go for brackish. And then what fish, again, depends on your setup. That'll help determine what tank you're going to get is what fish. If you like going for bigger fish, then bigger tank is probably what you're going to want to invest in. However, if you don't mind smaller fish, and for instance, for a freshwater tank, you can have a bunch of colorful tetras, you'll have lots of schooling fish. It's a pretty good setup. So for that kind of tank, maybe 10, max 20, and you can have maybe a lot of small schooling fish, and it'll be a really good tank if that's what you want. So that's one question to consider. Skip to step 5. I'll go in much more detail about what you can do and a lot of the possibilities. Now, step 2 and what your setup would be is the location. You want to get the location down because this is, again, going to be a limiting factor in what you're going to do. So you might even want to know where you're going to put this before you even start considering what kind of tank. Because there's a couple limitations to location is light. You can't have a whole lot of light. I mean, a little natural light is okay, but if it's blasting straight sunlight into your tank, you're going to have major algae issues later in life. So make sure not to put it in direct sunlight, so that'll help you minimize algae problems later. Traffic, also, don't put it next to a door where it could get slammed into. You really don't want to startle your fish later. That could cause some mortality and also just really stress them out. So don't put them next to doors, not super high traffic. You want people to see your aquarium, but you don't want it to be bumped or messed with. Make sure no one's tripping on the wires. Make sure there is an electrical outlet. In fact, you might want to get an extra cord with extra outlets, because I'll cover this more in the equipment section. But if you do go all out and decide to invest a lot of money into this to get more of the fancy equipment, you can end up using maybe 4 different electrical outlets for one aquarium, and I have many, so I need a lot of extension cords with a lot of more outlets. And also weight. I have this underlined because this is a major issue that I'm not sure how many people remember to look into before they buy an aquarium. If most serious aquarists know about this, and if you have any basic aquarium book, it usually mentions weight, but 1 gallon of water is maybe 10 pounds, so even a 10-gallon tank can be 100 pounds, and also just make sure your floor definitely can handle the weight of whatever tank you're buying. So yes, aquarium books and websites may say bigger is better, but also make sure your floor can handle it. So don't bring home that 500-gallon tank and then have it fall through your floor. You really aren't going to be happy with that. So just wait. Another thing to remember, check the resistance on your floor. Make sure it's not super sunlight. Don't put it next to a door. Location will also limit the size a little bit, just to make sure that, because if you don't have room for a gigantic tank, then you can't buy one. So there's that. So then when we get to the tank itself, what size do you want? This usually will vary on the kind of fish you want to get, or you could just get the biggest one you can. That's also a good plan. You could always get the tank first and plan after. That's not such a bad idea if you aren't really sure, because there are a lot of fish out there And or maybe just go to a fish store, figure out some fish you'd like, maybe pick a few favorites, make sure they're beginners and that you have what it takes to take care of them. Maybe start shaping a plan around one particular key fish and start getting that down. So tank size, also what kind of fish are you going to get, what size fits your plan, weight again, make sure you're not going to have a tank falling through your floor. Money, also this can be sort of an iffy qualification. Some people have a low budget and don't think they can get a good tank, but also if you want to wait and invest, there are at certain stores, for instance Petco is the one I can name, they have the $1 per gallon sale, so even if you can't afford a 100-gallon tank normally, maybe if you save $100 over a few years, you can buy yourself a nice 100-gallon tank for only $100 as opposed to whatever the regular price is. So there's deals like that. And then fish also, if you want the bigger fish, do try to invest in a bigger tank. If you don't mind the smaller fish, don't go buying yourself a 50-gallon tank if you're going to fill it with tiny 1-inch tetras. You could do it that way, but that you would need a lot of tetras and you might have a lot of empty space, but it could work. So these are pretty much some of the considerations, and I just have start here. Bear in mind your plan while you're doing your setup, and make it flexible. Because maybe over the years, because usually you don't get rid of an aquarium after a year or two, you'll have these for a while. Maybe one of your fish will pass away because their lifespans can vary from maybe a year. Betas, they only live for maybe a year and a quarter, 2 years. And they're usually already at least a year old when you buy them. And again, that's another thing to bear in mind, juvenile size versus adult. I'll get into that later. But just also, they can probably live for maybe 2 years to 30 if you're going into saltwater for some clownfish or some very big fish. Oscars also have a very long lifespan. But let's say you don't go into that and you maybe get a guppy or platy or something with not as long a lifespan necessarily, or you buy it when it's already fairly big, so it's already lived a good portion of its life. So maybe once things start to perish and you're starting to maybe get an empty tank, this happened to me several times with my freshwater tank. I've had it for maybe 7 years, and freshwater fish don't necessarily have as long a lifespan as saltwater fish. So sometimes maybe once you have an empty tank, you want to just start fresh. Maybe you want to go from community tank to solitary predator tank, or just keep it flexible. I just buy maybe a generic tank or go long. This is another thing, sort of the dimensions of your tank, because there's some which are just the plain rectangular, there's circular sort of, there's the long, tall ones, there's octangular, there's all sorts of crazy shapes out there. There are companies where you can buy custom inserts also. I've never done it, but it might be interesting. And there's just a lot of different shapes out there. There's a lot of different options you can do, and it just sort of fits your style. If you have a narrow space, then maybe a tall tank would work for you. Or if you have space to spread out, I would recommend going long if you can, because more surface area is more oxygen. It'll be good for the fish. You can maybe put a few more in there. Maybe you can get 1 more inch of fish in a 20 long as opposed to one that's very tall. Not necessarily a huge benefit, but it is a slightly better environment. And it's just one thing to consider. So that's another thing. Some aquarium books will recommend going long as opposed to high. I also follow this rule, but I guess if you really like a tall tank, won't necessarily stop you. Just make sure you have a lot of aeration if you go with a tall tank as opposed to a long one. And so yeah, just keep in mind, start forming the plan now, start thinking about fish. Before you even maybe go to step 5, just go to a fish store, go to maybe just Petco or whatever, the equivalent to wherever you are. Just look at some fish, pick out a favorite, then look at it, research it a lot, and figure out if you have the means to take care of it. See if you can maybe start building a tank for this fish and see if you can bring it home. And you can usually make really good plans by video 5, as I mentioned in the overview. I will cover a lot of different plans. I will just tell you as many as I can. And I'll also eventually recommend some good beginner fish for fresh brackets and saltwater. And eventually I will also maybe post some videos on the fish book library. because I will sometimes reference fish books, especially if I start getting questions from viewers, and it all depends. So I can recommend books on what to add to your library, maybe some magazines if you would like to get deeper into this field, and it all depends on viewers. So, yep, so just recap, start forming the plan, highlights, and get the position down, get the perfect position, make sure the weight can handle it, and make sure it fits your budget. Because again, if you start blowing the budget out on the tank, the fish you might have to put in there, or that you want to put in there, might also start pushing the budget. So make sure to not push the budget at first, and then you'll probably not push the budget later. And maybe I'll also show some other things I'm doing. I'm not sure. It can all depends. I have high hopes for this. And yep, so get the plan, tank size, just make sure it fits everything in these requirements. Keep the plan, make it flexible. You might want to change the kind of fish you have in there later, so make it flexible. Make it so you can have a couple of different kinds of fish in there, even if you don't have them in there all at once. So in case you want to change the scene in there, rearrange, that's another thing. Make sure you can rearrange things. Don't get too set on one setup. Fish don't mind a change. Not a change in location, just change scenery. I'll also get into aquascaping in step 3. And for the next video, click here.